I'm very happy to be with you all to talk about a subject of great consequence for our world, US-China relations. And clearly we are marching towards a great tragedy. A major geopolitical contest is going to break out, if it already hasn't broken out, between US-China relations. And we now know how serious this geopolitical contest is, because when COVID-19 happened, COVID-19 should have stopped the US-China geopolitical contest, because one of the oldest rules of geopolitics is that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So since COVID-19 is an enemy of the United States and COVID-19 is an enemy of China, the US and China should have come together to fight against COVID-19. Instead, as we know, the opposite happened, and actually the US and China geopolitical contest became even more aggravated despite COVID-19. So it's clearly being driven by very deep forces. And I think it's important to understand there's some of the structural forces that are creating this huge US-China geopolitical contest. And in my book, Has China Won, I discuss some of these structural forces. So let me just mention three. The first, of course, the first structural force is that there's a sort of almost a 2,000-year law of geopolitics, that whenever the world's #1 emerging power, which today is China, is about to overtake the world's #1 power, which today is the United States. And as the world's #1 emerging power gets closer and closer in size to the world's #1 power, the world's #1 power will try to push down the world's #1 emerging power. And in fact, there's a Harvard professor called Graham Allison, who's actually written a book called Destined for War, and he documents how this has happened throughout history. Of course, he predicts that war is more likely than not between US and China. I tend to be more optimistic. I think there'll be a major geopolitical contest, but there will not be an all-out war between US and China, because in a nuclear war, you don't have a winner and a loser, you have a loser and a loser. So that's why there will not be a war between US and China. The second structural force that's driving this contest is something that cannot be mentioned in the Western discourse, because it's politically incorrect to speak about it. But if you're an objective bystander watching what is happening in the US-China geopolitical contest, it's very clear that this contest is not just being driven by rational factors, it's also being driven by emotional factors. And where do these emotional factors come from? So what I argue in my book is that there has always been in the Western psyche deep down, a fear of the yellow peril. And so, here is China emerging as a great power. And this is the first time that a non-Western power is becoming #1 in the world for over 200 years or so. So it conjures up those fears that have lain buried in the Western mind, Western psyche for a long time. And that also explains why this US-China geopolitical contest is carrying on, when in fact they should be cooperating with each other against COVID-19. And the third structural force I will mention also, because it explains why there's a kind of a bipartisan consensus in the United States against China. And this bipartisan consensus is a result of many factors, in part the two factors I mentioned earlier, but also because many Americans genuinely believe that as the United States engage China, and they offer, they all call it communist China always, the United States believe that if the United States could open up the economy of China, after China opened up its economy, China would then open up its political system, and then China would become like America, and they would live happily ever after because they are fellow democracies. This is, of course, an expectation that actually some former officials have spoken about quite openly. For example, Kurt Campbell has mentioned it in an essay in the magazine Foreign Affairs, and also more recently, many of you must have seen pirated copies of the book by John Bolton, which is spreading around the world. And in that book, John Bolton also mentions that the United States is disappointed that China hasn't become like America. Although I always emphasize that future historians will be very puzzled that a young republic like the United States, which is less than 250 years old, with 1/4 the population of China, this young republic believes that if it engaged China, China would become like America, rather than America become like China, even though China's civilization is at least 4,000 years old. So this shows you how misunderstanding can arise between US and China. So it's very clear that a major geopolitical contest has gone underway between US and China. But the sad part is that the United States has embarked on this geopolitical contest without first working out a comprehensive long-term strategy on how to manage this geopolitical contest against China. And the man actually who gave me this insight was probably clearly America's greatest living strategic thinker, was Henry Kissinger. And I had a one-on-one lunch with him in New York in March 2018 when I was doing research for this book that I wrote, Has China Won? And it was at that lunch where basically the message to me was that it's a mistake for the United States to go into this contest without working out strategy. And of course, the other point I emphasize in my book also is that there was a great American strategic thinker called George Kennan. He was the man who actually formulated the US strategy against the Soviet Union. And even though he advocated a very strong containment policy against the Soviet Union, he also gave very valuable advice to his fellow Americans. And I mentioned 4 pieces of advice. The first thing he said is that the outcome of the contest between the United States and China will not be determined by guns and bombs and things like that, but not by the size of our militaries. It will be determined by our domestic vitality, by how strong our economy is and how well our people are doing. So that's what he emphasized. And what's interesting is that when the United States is taking on this geopolitical contest against China, which is a major undertaking, it is doing so at a time when the American economy is clearly struggling and the American people themselves are struggling. I mean, you know, America is the only major developed country where the average income of the bottom 50% has gone down over a 30-year period. And so George Kennan would be very upset. He says, how come you're not taking care of our domestic spiritual vitality first before embarking on this great contest against China? The second piece of advice that Kennan gave is that, you know, you must cultivate friends and allies because we can never win this battle against Soviet Union on our own. And what is strange is that the Trump administration, instead of cultivating friends and allies, is actually alienating friends and allies, while at the same time while taking on this geopolitical contest with China. And that's why you notice that very few allies of the United States are jumping in enthusiastically to support this Americans in the contest against China. And the third piece of advice that Kennan gave, he said, don't insult our adversaries because if we deal with them, sadly, the Trump administration, which I think is unwisely, has been insulting China. And of course, the final piece of advice that Kennan gave, which is very important and which he kept repeating several times, was he said, be humble, you know, because that's how we're going to win friends. And sadly, the Trump administration is doing the opposite. So you can see that even though the United States has undertaken a major geopolitical contest against China, it hasn't worked out a strategy, and in fact, is making serious mistakes in its management of China. But at the same time, I think, you know, in any contest, it's never a case where one side is right and the other side is wrong. Both sides are right, both sides are wrong in many ways. And China too has made some serious mistakes in its management of the United States. And one key mistake that China made, which has actually in many ways disadvantaged China very significantly, is that it has alienated the one constituency in America that used to be the most pro-China constituency in America. And this was, of course, the American business community. And the and ever since the days of the first rapprochement between US and China in 1971, when Henry Kissinger went to China, initially there wasn't much engagement at the business level. But over time, after Deng Xiaoping opened up the Chinese economy, and the Chinese economy grew, American businesses saw great opportunities for American business in China. So you could see that a lot of businessmen from America flocked to China, and some American companies like Boeing sold incredible number of aircraft in China. General Motors made more money in China than in America. So there was a strong American business community supporting good ties with China. But unfortunately, in the past decade or so, China became somewhat arrogant, and certainly a bit arrogant after the 2008-2009 financial crisis. And its arrogance showed in the way that it treated the American business community in China, and over time it has alienated them. And that's why, even though in previous episodes, whenever when an American government wanted to take on the Chinese government, the American business community would speak out and say, stop, stop. But this time around, they didn't speak out. They kept absolutely quiet. And that's why there's, as I said, bipartisan support for this contest. But now that this contest is underway, of course, the big question everybody is asking is, who's going to win, who's going to lose? And of course, we will not know the answer. This is a long-term struggle. But I think the one mistake that the United States has made is that the United States has consistently overestimated its strength and underestimated the strengths of China. And, you know, so, and I give a couple of examples of how they have overestimated their strengths and underestimated China. And so, for example, the Americans, one reason why the Americans have plunged into this geopolitical contest without working out a strategy, because they have this very deep, strong ideological belief that if you have a contest within a democracy and a rigid communist party system, democracies are dynamic, flexible, and they are, of course, a democracy will always outperform a rigid communist party system, and that's what they believe. And of course, I don't disagree with that premise. Dynamic democracies, and America, by the way, which has been the most successful society that human beings have seen in the last maybe 2,000-3,000 years, clearly is an extraordinary society with dramatic strengths and has done very well. And in fact, in my book, I also say that China should never underestimate the United States, because it's a remarkably strong society. But at the same time, what the United States hasn't noticed is that the United States, which used to be a dynamic democracy, actually has become a plutocracy. Now, this is a very important point. And I'm not the only person making that point. Martin Wolf, probably the most influential economics commentator in the world from the Financial Times, has also pointed out that America has become a plutocracy. And in a plutocracy, instead of a government of the people, by the people, for the people, which is what you're supposed to get in a democracy, it's a government of the people, by the rich, for the rich. And as a result of that, that explains why the bottom 50% have not seen an improvement in their livelihoods, and explains why American inequality has shot through the roof, you know. And so you had that, and if America has become a plutocracy, America is disadvantaging itself in this contest against China. And by contrast, China, which is supposed to be run by a rigid, top-down communist party system, has actually become one of the world's most effective meritocracies. And what is a meritocracy? A meritocracy is an organization or a government that selects the best people to serve in government. And amazingly, the Chinese system has enabled the Chinese government to select the best and brightest to work in the government and in other key leadership positions. And that explains why China's extraordinary economic success record. It reflects the incredible amount of investments that they have made in their people. So, for example, when I joined the Singapore Foreign Service almost 50 years ago in 1971, there was no question that American diplomats were far more better informed, more sophisticated, more knowledgeable people. And the Chinese diplomats in 1971 used to wear the Maoist suits and carry Mao's little red book in their pockets. But now, today, fast forward to 2020, when you go around the world, you find that the Chinese diplomats are often much better educated, speak the languages, understand the situation very well. And by contrast, sadly, as you know, this is an open fact now, the US State Department has become so demoralized as a result of mishandling over several decades. So you can see how there's no longer a contest between a dynamic democracy and a rigid communist party system. It's a contest between a meritocracy and a plutocracy. And if you have that kind of contest, then the meritocracy can win, something that hasn't been factored in. And just to give you another example about how, if you compare the strengths of the Chinese system and the American system, again, the Americans believe that their system is open and flexible. But I have a whole chapter in my book called Can America Make U-Turns? So for example, I'll give you two examples of U-turns that America should make. Earlier on, I quoted George Kennan, and George Kennan said very clearly that at the end of the day, the outcome of a contest against the Soviet Union is not going to be determined by the number of guns and bombs that we have. It's going to be determined by the vitality of our society. So we should not overspend money on defense. So clearly, logically, what the United States should be doing now is to focus on reviving its economy and cutting down its defense budget. That is sensible U-turn to make to deal with the competition from China. And it will be in America's interest to do so. But what's interesting is that even though America has had brilliant defense secretaries, Ash Carter, General Mattis, the brilliant defense secretaries cannot cut down the US defense budget because it's determined not through a rational process of purchasing weapons, but it's determined by lobbying from congressmen, senators who say, whatever you do, don't close down this military production facility in my district, because if you do that, my district will lose jobs. So as a consequence of that, the American defense budget has become huge, bloated, and become a liability to America. But America cannot make a U-turn down there. And to give you another example of where America cannot make U-turns, if indeed America believes that number one strategic challenge for America today is China, and there's no doubt it's China, what it should do is stop fighting wars in the Middle East, stop dropping bombs in the Middle East, And this again would be in America's national interest to do so. But again, you cannot make a U-turn because the American decision-making is so rigid that they cannot get out of conflicts that they should get out of. And as a result, every geopolitical contest or conflict the United States fights in the Middle East is essentially a geopolitical gift to China. And this is an example of how the US system is not flexible and responsive to changes. So this is how there's a lot of misunderstanding in the United States of what it will need to do to take on this contest with China. Now, let me conclude by talking about, of course, how the rest of the world is going to respond to this US-China geopolitical contest, because sadly for us, those of us who are not either American or Chinese, we are not directly participating in this contest, but we're going to be affected by this contest when the two biggest elephants in the world start jostling each other. But one key point I make in my book is that even if you have 330 million people in the United States and 1.4 billion people in China, that still leaves 6 billion people outside US and China. And the majority of the 6 billion people do not want to get involved in this contest. They got more important things to do. They want to focus on fighting COVID-19. They want to focus on fighting global warming, but they are affected by this contest. So I think the majority of the 6 billion people outside the US and China are saying basically that please consider the needs of the world before you proceed to, with this contest. So one reason why I wrote my book at this time is to try and get voices of the rest of the world to speak out and to explain directly to both US and China there are much more important things for the world to do than to get engaged in this contest. And that's also why I'm happy to speak to you and to your group, because I'm curious to find out how people in Nepal are viewing this US-China geopolitical contest, and I'm keen to hear their perspectives also. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Since we have really less time and lots of questions, let's move directly to the questions. I'll be trying to come with a set of 3 or 4 questions so that it'll be easy for you to club together and talk about it. What kind of world order are you going to witness post-COVID-19? Is it going to be China-dominated world order, or is it going to be multipolar with many Asian powers, or there'll be no change at all? Second is, what will be the impact of US-China trade war on Asia in general and on China in particular? Third question is on Nepal. Nepal lies between 2 Asian giants, China and India. Both are economic and military power of Asia, but with different political system. In this context, how can a small country like Nepal formulate its foreign policy? And fourth is, how do you look at current India-China border standoff?
I think I could take 1 hour to answer each question, I think. But I'll give you, maybe I'll give you what telegraphic answers, I guess. That's the best thing to do, because otherwise we will spend several hours together. Now, on the world order, I must emphasize to everyone that we are living in a time of great change. And there are changes across many dimensions taking place. And just to give you an obvious example, okay? If you look at what COVID-19 has done to the world, right? The conventional wisdom in the West is that because of COVID-19, we had to close our borders, international travel has stopped, international trade has come down, and so the world, which used to be going towards globalization, is now going towards de-globalization. And that's the consensus in the Western world. And it may be proven right. I mean, we'll find out. But I believe that it's the opposite that is happening. Because, you know, what's interesting is that even though we have been locked up in our countries, our minds have been connected to this digital universe that you and I are on now. And there are people from several countries, I believe, watching this, this discussion. So if there's any demonstration, you need a demonstration that we live in one world, switch on Zoom. And you can see how the whole world connects instantly. And there was one evening when I was sitting in this chair, from 8 to 8:45 p.m., I was talking to an audience in London, Chatham House. From 8:45 p.m. to 9:45 p.m., I was talking to the Confederation of Indian Industry in New Delhi. And then from 9:45 to 11 p.m., I was in Yale University participating in the meeting of the President's Council. So in 3 hours, I touched every continent. Now that's remarkable. That shows you what the technology has transformed the world. So people who say that we're going to de-globalize obviously don't understand the larger trends that are happening in the world. And at the same time, in terms of whether the world will be unipolar, multipolar, I have absolutely no doubt that it will be a multipolar world. And there'll be many actors in the world. And so far, take for example, the European Union. Sadly, it hasn't seized the leadership opportunity it has in today's world. I just wrote a piece for the World Economic Forum that's just been released. You can go to the World Economic Forum website and get it, where I say the world will be happier to see the European Union provide boring leadership to the world, which is rules-bound, stable, predictable. That's what the world needs. So it will not be a unipolar or bipolar world. It will be a multi-polar world. Now, the trade war is very hard to figure out because we are still in the middle of the trade war, okay? And the trade war, frankly, was irrational. And frankly, today, at a time when the United States economy, the Chinese economy, in fact, all the economies of the world are suffering from COVID-19, the most sensible thing the United States could do is to just say, no more trade war. I lift all tariffs. Let the world go back to where it was before this happened. And that's the best way to jumpstart the world. So the laws of economics have not changed. So if you want to prosper, you basically have the North Korean model, where you close up your country, or you have the South Korean model, you open up your country. And I think at one stage, the North Korean and South Korean economies were the same size. Today, the South Korean economy, I don't know, 300 times the size of North Korea. That shows you what happens to countries. You either close up your country and you don't grow, or you open up your country and grow. So I think at the end of the day, people will still go back to opening up their economies and participating in international trade. Now, your question on Nepal, actually, I should be asking you, what should Nepal do? Because I think Nepal, to put it very simply, is in a very difficult position. I mean, let's be very honest. In fact, in my book, I also did say that many, many countries are going to be in a difficult position. I'll give you another example, a much richer country than Nepal, and much more powerful country than Nepal, but that country is Australia. And of all the countries in the world, the country that's going to have the hardest time dealing with this US-China geopolitical contest is Australia, because its defense, its political system, its culture is all tied to the United States, 99%. But its economy is tied mostly to China. And I mean, if, for example, if the Australians cut off their trade with China, an act of economic suicide, yeah, the economy will shrink dramatically. So you can see how lots of countries will have difficult choices to make. And so I would say, the only thing I would say to Nepal is be very, very careful. Because one of the oldest rules in geopolitics is that, I think, actually, when I went for an online meeting in 1979 in Cuba, Havana, the then president of Sri Lanka said, remember the old proverb, when elephants fight, the grass suffers. But when elephants make love, the grass also suffers. So small countries, including Singapore, have to be very careful also in this thing. Now, India, China, of course, is a much longer subject. I suspect many of you are greater experts in this field than I am. But I would say that what's happened at the border recently in the middle of June was truly tragic and unnecessary. And what's interesting is that there was no loss of life between 1975 and 2020. So for 45 years, there was no loss of life. And sadly, in one day, it happened. I hope that both governments will realize the wisdom of what Prime Minister Manmohan Singh said with Premier Wen Jiabao. He said the world is big enough for China and India to grow together. And I think if you look at the priorities of the Chinese people, the priorities of the Indian people, the real priorities of these two countries are to eradicate poverty, to grow the economy, to engage in more trade with each other. So that should be what these two countries should be focused on. So I'm still hoping that they'll be able to find ways, and it'll be difficult, it'll be delicate. They'll find ways and means of ensuring that this doesn't happen again at the border as it happened.
Let me move to the second round of questions. How Singapore view ASEAN integration vis-a-vis South China Sea dispute? Are we really well integrated in defense and security posturing with the regional issues? Second is there is discussion in India on boycotting of Chinese product. Can India afford to boycott Chinese goods? What will be the impact of it? What will be its impact on Indian economy and India-China relations? Third is how can India take advantage to Singapore's sway in the ASEAN to strengthen ties with the bloc and therefore help its position in the Indo-Pacific? The last question for this round is how, like many countries are boycotting Huawei for their 5G program. How is Singapore reacting to it? Is there US-China rivalry on this issue in Singapore?
Well, they're all very good questions. On ASEAN, if there's one message, I want to give you some positive messages because I'm giving lots of negative messages. It's going to be a difficult one, and I want to emphasize that. And if you better be prepared for a difficult world psychologically that's coming. But there's also good news in some areas. And one of the pieces of good news is that the one region on planet Earth that should not see a successful regional organization is Southeast Asia. Why? Because Southeast Asia is by far the most diverse corner of planet Earth. Out of 650 million people, you have over 200 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, and then you have Confucianists, Taoists, Hindus, and even communists in Southeast Asia. It's the most diverse region of planet Earth. And this is where regional cooperation should fail. And yet, ASEAN has emerged as the second most successful regional organization after the European Union. And that's why I wrote a book called The ASEAN Miracle. And I'm actually quite shocked that countries in South Asia have not tried to come and learn from ASEAN. Why has ASEAN succeeded, right? And clearly, ASEAN's success provides hope to many, many developing regions. You cannot learn anything from the European Union. European Union is a construct of developed countries that create these very rigid, legalistic agreements, and at the end of the day, it's led to Brexit. So if you had asked me 10 years ago, would the EU break up first or ASEAN break up first, I would have said ASEAN break up first. Now you saw the European Union is breaking up first because of Brexit. And why is ASEAN not breaking up? Because ASEAN is the world's most imperfect organization. And I say ASEAN moves like a crab. It takes one step forward, one step backwards, one step sideways. It seems to be going around in circles all the time. And yet at the end of each decade, you look at the ASEAN GNP, it's amazing how fast it has grown over the past few decades. And combined together, ASEAN is already the 7th largest economy in the world and going to become the 4th largest economy in the world. So the ASEAN success story is something that South Asia should study. And I believe the SAARC headquarters are in Nepal, if I'm not mistaken. And clearly I understand why there isn't a greater understanding of ASEAN within SAARC. So yes, South China Sea is going to be a problem. But I can assure you that between the ASEAN claimants and China, there'll be no war, right? And I very confidently make that prediction because there's a culture of pragmatism in the region, a culture of pragmatism that ASEAN has created that is alive in this region. And if South Asia could copy ASEAN, and if you just had normal trade among all the South Asian countries, your trade would grow dramatically, right? So come and learn from ASEAN. Now on the boycotting, boycotting is something that makes you feel good psychologically. But at the end of the day, you must always make a rational, practical calculations. When people buy goods from China, they're not buying goods from China because they like China. They buy goods from China because China gives them the cheapest phone, right? The cheapest smartphone you want to get is from China. So if you want to get access to Wikipedia, and get all the information in the world, you try and look for the cheapest smartphone. You cannot get it from Apple, the cheapest smartphone. You have to get it from China. So at the sense, when you boycott these products, in many critical areas, you're shooting yourself in the foot. So I predict that, of course, in the initial phase, when people are emotional, they do all these things. But I hope that when the leaders make the decisions, they will think calmly and rationally about what should be done. The third question was about India and ASEAN. And today, India enjoys a tremendous geopolitical opportunity in ASEAN. Because clearly, and this is also what I discuss in my book, Has China Won? ASEAN is going to be very, very troubled by the US-China geopolitical contest. Because within ASEAN, within the 10 countries, I'm going to give a big secret away to you. There are some countries that are very pro-American, like Vietnam. And there's logical reason why Vietnam is pro-American, because Vietnam has been a neighbor for China for 2,000 years. And Vietnam has been occupied by China only 1,000 years. So it's quite natural for Vietnam to be more pro-American than pro-Chinese. And at the other extreme, you have a country like Cambodia, which is very pro-China. This is also well known. So how you run an organization that has got pro-American, pro-Chinese members is going to be difficult. But that's ASEAN's genius. It can take care of these difficulties. But at the same time, ASEAN is looking for other partners. It wants to have a stronger partnership with other countries like the European Union, like Japan, and especially India. And one of the most important facts about Southeast Asia that everyone should know is that out of the 9 countries in Southeast Asia, out of the 10 countries in Southeast Asia, 9 have an Indic cultural base. So you see the Ramayana, the Mahabharata performed in Indonesia, in Thailand, and amazingly enough, when the president of the Philippines hosted an East Asian summit, I think in 2017, even though Philippines is like 90% Christian Catholic country, he performed the Ramayana to the audience that was coming. That shows you how deep the Indian cultural roots are in Southeast Asia. So India should see the ASEAN region as a region which it should cultivate, which is why, by the way, it's a big tragedy that India couldn't join the regional Cooperative Economic Partnership, RCEP, because that would have been an opportunity for India and ASEAN to get even closer. And finally, on Huawei, I would say that the decisions will be made in Singapore, at least, on commercial grounds. And but you of course be very careful on this. So I understand, for example, that Singtel is going with I forget now, Nokia or Ericsson. But again, that's a commercial decision that they've made.
Let me go with the last round of question. How the new world order and current status of China impact the existing asymmetry, mutual trust perception in China-India relations, especially in the context of COVID-19 and the ongoing territorial disputes. Second is, why had China refused to sort out border issues with India? Does China want to warn India not to approach America? And
what's the second question? Sorry.
Second is, why had China refused to sort out the border issue with India? Does China want to warn India not to approach America? Other is, there are news of China sinking Vietnamese boats in Western Pacific. There are surveillances along Miyako Strait and there is American inability to restrict it. How do you think China is planning to leverage the COVID-19 crisis to change the status quo in the region? And the last is, how far is it pragmatic that India would strategically align with the US by overlooking its immediate neighbor, China?
Well, again, those are very, very big questions. I think the first question and the fourth question are similar, if I understood them well. It's basically about India's position in the US-China geopolitical game. And I would say, the important thing in geopolitics is that you must never get emotional. You must be very cold and calculating. And the winners in any geopolitical games are not the emotional countries, but the countries that are very cunning and calculating. And I can give you an example of a very cold, calculating, cunning person. His name is Richard Nixon, the former president of the United States. And I'm going to read to you, there's a very good book called Rise to Globalism by Stephen Ambrose, an American. And he describes how cunning United States was under Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. As you know, in the 1960s, now we've seen a border problem between India and China. There was a much bigger border problem between China and the then Soviet Union in 1969. There were much larger clashes, much larger loss of life. But Richard Nixon immediately said, there's an opportunity for United States. We can exploit these differences. So let me read to you what the passage says. It appeared that Nixon saw vast possibilities for the United States in a Sino-Soviet split. He specifically believed that he could manage the split so as to force the Communist powers to abandon North Vietnam. And then the way to get China and Russia to cooperate, Nixon reasoned, was, and this is a critical line, was to keep them guessing about actual United States intentions. Let me repeat that. Was to keep them guessing about actual United States intentions. So he will give the impression to China, oh, I'm very friendly to you. He will give the impression to the Soviet Union, oh, I'm very friendly to you. And both sides will be guessing. And both sides will then try and work harder to build good relations with the US. So he exploited the split. So in the same way, the biggest geopolitical contest in the world is not today, not between India and China. The biggest geopolitical contest is between, on the one hand, United States on one side and China on the other side. And the best position for India geopolitically is to stand somewhere. If you can imagine a seesaw with the United States on one side and China on the other side, the best place, the most cunning place for India to take is to stand in the middle and then try and balance once against the other and take full advantage of it. But that's a cold, cunning game that is required. And I think that opportunity still exists for India in this situation. It would require, of course, you got to manage the border challenge. And that's the second question now on the border issue. Now, I'm not an expert on the border issue. I haven't studied it myself. But I do know that in the past, some Chinese leaders have actually offered to India, made the offer saying, why don't you just accept the current actual control, lines of control? I think if I'm not mistaken, Zhou Enlai made that offer sometime to Nehru, but don't hold me to this. Please check your history books. And I'm told that when Deng Xiaoping met Rajiv Gandhi, he also made a similar kind of offer. Why don't we just accept the border as it is and not try to do anything, you know? And I think if those offers had been seized, then I think you would not have had this problem today. But whether or not these offers are still open, I'm not sure. So, but it will require very delicate negotiations on both sides. But at the end of the day, I believe anyway that both sides can actually live with the existing line of control. But the only question is, in some pockets, you've got to decide exactly where that is. And by the way, I'm going to mention tomorrow. I'm a distinguished fellow at the Asia Research Institute. Tomorrow, the Asia Research Institute is going to launch something called the Asian Peace Program. It's confidential for another 24 hours. The press release is coming out tomorrow. And at the same time, this Asian Peace Program is going to suggest ways and means to manage current conflicts and how you diffuse them. So we are also going to issue an essay tomorrow by a former colleague of mine at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, Professor Kanti Bajpai, and he's suggesting ways and means on how to manage this India-China issue. So I can give you one example he makes is that, as you know, a lot of the loss of life happened because Chinese soldiers and Indian soldiers came face to face. He says, why don't we just move the soldiers back and put all kinds of virtual instruments, right, that can monitor. So you don't need human beings to monitor things anymore. You have all kinds of technology that can monitor the border. So why not use that technology to monitor the border? So there are ways and means of diffusing conflicts like that. So we should explore that. And I hope you'll look at this essay tomorrow by Kanti Bajpai and let me know what you think about it. Then, of course, you have your question about Vietnamese vessels in the South China Sea and so on and so forth. And you will have a lot of close encounters in the South China Sea. And this is why it's very important for everybody to be very careful. But at the same time, I must emphasize that when you read stories about what's happening in the South China Sea, you must be careful of the stories you get from the Anglo-Saxon media. Because the Anglo-Saxon media will only give you the negative stories about China and never tell you anything that's positive about what China is doing. And this is a fact. And in my book, I tell one story. Now, in the Anglo-Saxon media, they always say, this is a constant line they use, they say that President Xi Jinping lied about the South China Sea. And how did President Xi lie about the South China Sea? They say, well, President Xi offered to demilitarize the South China Sea when he met Obama, which by the way is correct. And then after that, President Xi proceeded to militarize the South China Sea. So he was clearly lying to Obama. Now, even very sophisticated analysts of China believe this story. So fortunately for me, when I was doing the research for my book, Has China Won?, I met one of the best US ambassadors ever sent to China. His name is Stapleton Roy, and he actually grew up in China and speaks Chinese fluently. And he told me the story. He says, Kishore, it is true that President Xi offered to President Obama to demilitarize the South China Sea. And Ambassador Stapleton Roy said to me, Kishore, when President Xi made that offer, we should have seized that offer. We should have taken it immediately. Then we would have demilitarized the South China Sea. He said, sadly, instead of accepting that offer, we sent the US Navy in the South China Sea. And when the US sent the Navy in South China Sea, China said, okay, you rejected my offer for demilitarization? Let's proceed with the militarization. And I have his permission. You can read that story in my book. So it's very important. The problem for us is that we are all prisoners of the Anglo-Saxon media. So whatever is the dominant narrative in the Anglo-Saxon media, it becomes the narrative that we hear. So we hear all about Chinese aggression in the South China Sea, but we never hear about the Chinese efforts to try and find the solutions in the South China Sea. And you never hear about the aggravations of other people in the South China Sea. So I can give you some other stories. For example, China is accused of reclaiming land in the South China Sea and on reefs and rocks. It's true. It's true. But who started it? Unfortunately, unwisely, Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam started it. So when they started, China said, okay, you reclaim your reefs, I reclaim my reefs. But the difference is that Malaysians may reclaim 2 acres, China will reclaim 2,000 acres. So that's the game. And at the end of the day, there's one reality where we have to understand that China is going to emerge as a great power. And all great powers will use their muscles. There's no such thing as a benign great power. The term benign great power is an oxymoron. All great powers will use their power to enhance their interests. That's a reality. And the question, therefore, for us is how we manage these great powers. And I think it's important to understand that where there are opportunities, we should take advantage of them. And you know, I mentioned in the very beginning of my remarks, the book by Graham Allison, where he talks about the inevitability of a war between US and China. And you know, one of the stories Graham Allison says in his book, this is what he says. He says, you know, we Americans, we keep saying, why can't China be like us, right? And Graham Allison says, be careful. Be careful what you wish for. Think twice before you ask the China to be like us, because when America emerged as a great power, because China in 2020, in terms of relative emergence, is where United States was in the year 1900, when Theodore Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy and all that. And what did the United States do when it suddenly developed great power muscles? It immediately began wars. It declared a war against Spain, seized Philippines, seized Guam, seized territories, launched strikes, and so on and so forth, right? And Graham Allison says, do you really want China to be like America? Think twice. So I think where there are still opportunities, and that's why the main message of my book is why it is actually completely irrational and unnecessary for the United States to engage in this geopolitical contest, because both are in some way or another going to emerge as losers. So it's better for them to step aside and focus on common interests and common challenges, especially common interests and common challenges for humanity, like COVID-19, like global warming, and work together on that. So that's the reason why I'm talking to you and writing this book, is that I'm trying to my best to prevent a completely unnecessary geopolitical contest from emerging.
So if you have time, shall you take one last question?
Sure, sure.
Okay. How should India, or for the matter of other South Asian countries, respond to the contrasting geopolitical pools and pressure from China and US amidst the escalating and evolving sort of Cold War like we had in Soviet and United States?
Well, I think, as I mentioned earlier, India has a remarkable geopolitical opportunity. And as I said, if Nixon could be very cunning in exploiting the Sino-Soviet split, India can also be very cunning in exploiting this split between China and the United States. And I can tell you that the rest of the world will be very happy if India emerged as an independent third force. Because that's what the world wants. The world wants to see a power big enough, strong enough to resist just either United States or from China and play the role of an independent actor. And I'll tell you why the world, give you an example why the world wants this, why they want countries to be independent. You know, in the mid-1990s, before I went, my second time as ambassador to the UN, I don't know how many of you, some of you might know this story. In the mid-1990s, two countries contested against each other for a seat in the UN Security Council. One was the second richest country in the world, Japan. And the second country was, at that time, one of the relatively poorer countries in the world. That was Bangladesh. So everyone thought, oh, Japan will definitely defeat Bangladesh because Japan is the second richest country in the world. Japan was going to all the developing countries and saying, I'm giving you so much aid, I'm giving you so much aid, I'm giving you so much aid. Especially in Africa, they're giving so much aid to Africa. The Japanese were very confident that they would defeat Bangladesh. No problem, they thought. You know, no contest. to their absolute surprise, they were defeated by Bangladesh. It was a huge shock to Japan. So when I went to the UN soon after that, I met some of the African ambassadors. I said, why did you vote for Bangladesh instead of Japan? Japan is giving you far more aid. And the answer these African ambassadors gave was very wise. They said, if I vote for Japan, I'm not giving a vote to Japan. I'm giving 2 votes to United States in the UN Security Council. But if I vote for Bangladesh, I'm getting another vote in the Security Council that is independent, right? So clearly, if India comes out and emerges and is seen to be as a strong, independent player, not tied to either China or United States, believe me, the whole world would cheer India on and say, that's what we need. We need a third strong voice in the world today. And basically there's no other country that can do it. No other country. I mean, India is 1.3 billion people. It's the only country that's big enough to stand up to India and to China and United States. So there is actually, despite all the difficulties that India is going through, there's a tremendous geopolitical opportunity for India. But then you need people with the cunning of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, who are among the most cunning people when they were in office, to seize these opportunities.
So I think we still have some time and we really want to use this opportunity because still we have around 30 questions. So let me try to put 2 because I think maybe in 5 minutes we can look.
5 minutes, I have to, yeah.
Okay.
We have another meeting. Yeah.
Yes, so maybe 1 question then. Is democracy incompatible and aligned political design to Chinese civilization, state and Chinese genealogy? Does he foresee or foretell economic freedom can ultimately lead to political aspirations of civil freedoms and liberty? Democracy is, in fact, promotes meritocracy to those competents who takes risks and contests for best public policy options to the people. So that is 1. And second, is there any possibility of pacifist bandwagoning in South Asia?
Any possibility of what?
Is there a possibility of pacifist bandwagoning in South Asia?
Pacifist?
Yes. I don't know what this question means. We got it from the audience.
Well, I would say, I mean, yeah, if by pacifist you mean don't fight wars, yes, don't fight wars. In fact, we should avoid wars. And fortunately, the world has become more and more peaceful. And we hope to make it more peaceful with our Asian Peace Program, which we're launching tomorrow. But the first set of questions, I want to say, by the way, I addressed those questions in a chapter in my book called Should China Become Democratic? It's a long chapter. And what is the basic message in that chapter? Everybody believes, and you know when I said earlier, Graham Allison said, be careful what you wish for. I can tell you one thing. If tomorrow China suddenly switched and went from a communist party system and suddenly became a robust democracy, China, which has a robust democracy run by a popularly elected leader, will be far more assertive than a China that's run by the Communist Party of China. I guarantee you that. Because when you have democracy, you have popular pressures, right? And it hams in leaders, right? So, you know, the Chinese Communist Party is the only force strong enough to restrain Chinese nationalism. And you must understand, surely there's one important thing you must understand, the Chinese people went through 100 years of humiliation. From the Opium War to the establishment of the People's Republic of China, 1842 to 1949, they suffered so much. So there's a very strong desire for revenge. But the Chinese Communist Party is able to contain and manage that. And so those who wish for democracy should listen to Graham Allison, be careful what you wish for. And similarly, in terms of the Chinese people, You know, when I first went to China in 1980, 40 years ago, the Chinese people did not have the freedom to choose what to wear, where to live, where to work, what to study, and they couldn't travel overseas. Today, the Chinese people enjoy all those personal freedoms. And I quote a Stanford University psychologist, Jean Fan, who says that if you talk of vibrancy of societies, today the Chinese people are enjoying one of the most vibrant societies in the world. They've really seen a far greater improvement in their standard of living than any other society has over 40 years. And the past 40 years of improvement in China have been the best 40 years in 4,000 years of Chinese history. So why should the Chinese people now take a big risk and change everything when things are going so well for them? So this is why, if you read the Anglo-Saxon narrative on China, you completely misunderstand China. And that's what, again, my book tries to balance it out by saying, don't just listen to the Anglo-Saxon narrative. There are other narratives also on China and on the US-China relationship.
Thank you, sir. We know that you have really tight schedule and will not take extra minutes. Professor Kishore Mahbubani, we are really thankful for your valuable time. It was our privilege to have you with us. We learned a lot and wish to invite you again on some other occasions. We'd also like to thank our audience in Zoom room and those who are watching us on Facebook Live. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Thank you.